Good evening, everyone who's here on the East Coast of the United States. Good morning to all of you in Tokyo. We are delighted that you have time to join us. We're going to have an amazing conversation with a talented group of panelists tonight about the U.S.-Japan partnership and beyond. So we're looking at the U.S.-Japan partnership not only for the bilateral relationship that we have, but also the way in which this alliance has become so critical to the international relations of the Indo-Pacific, but also globally as well. This is Asia Undercurrent. We are coming at the end of season 4 of a variety of really important conversations about Japan, its foreign policy, and its relationship with the United States, of course, but also with other partners around the world. So I am Sheila Smith. I'm the John E. Marrow Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a longtime student of Japan, a longtime observer of the U.S.-Japan partnership, and of the way in which it has evolved over time has been just a fascinating story, especially of late. I wanted to let you know, first of all, those of you who are on the Nikkei channel or the YouTube live, watching us from either of those platforms, if you scroll down, you will find an opportunity, a place where you can ask a question. We really, really want to hear from you. So please take the opportunity. If you have something in your mind that you'd really like to ask the panelists, please pop your question into that box. You know, the background for this webinar really is to come back home in a way to think about the U.S.-Japan partnership. We have had political change in both countries, in Japan and the United States. We have Ishiba-san, Prime Minister Ishiba is leading his cabinet from Tokyo. We are now in our second month, I believe, of a new second Trump administration here in the United States. And it would be an understatement for me to say that political change at home produces significant changes often in foreign policy. So this is a pretty incredible moment to be thinking about what's ahead of us in addition to what's been behind us. Let me introduce the panelists. Some of you will know them and know them well. I don't know where they appear on my screen, but let me start with Nick Szechenyi, who is the Vice President in Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, as well as a Senior Fellow Japan Chair for the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Shihoko Goto is the Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Wilson Center, also here in Washington, D.C. And third, from our sitting in Tokyo on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, but also centered in the Indo-Pacific down in Sydney, Australia, is Hayley Channer, who is the Director of the Economic Security Program with the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. The bios of all three speakers are available to you in great depth, but all three of our panelists are experts on the U.S.-Japan partnership. They have worked on the security aspects of the relationship and the geopolitical changes in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the emerging agenda on economic security between the United States and Japan and other regional partners. So we've got a very knowledgeable group. You've probably seen them quoted in all of the U.S. media as well as regional media. So we couldn't be much happier to have everyone here with us tonight. I'm going to start off with you, Nick, to ask you to give us your opening thoughts on where the U.S.-Japan partnership is at the moment, and then we can follow on from there. Nick, welcome.
Thank you, Sheila. Real pleasure to join you all. I thought I'd just kick things off by reflecting on the summit meeting between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump in early February, then add a few comments on what's happened since, and close with some observations on the way forward. So when I think about the Trump-Ishiba summit, I really think that it was a source of reassurance for the Ishiba government in Japan. What struck me most, actually, was the joint press conference between the two leaders. About halfway through, one of the journalists asked President Trump for his impressions of Prime Minister Ishiba, and he said, "He's tough. I wish he was weak, but he's tough." I'm paraphrasing, but I think that was really profound because it reminded me of the legacy of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who basically during Trump's first term convinced him that Japan is a strong, reliable ally. Fundamentally, that Japan is willing to stand up to China. And I think Prime Minister Ishiba reinforced that message during the summit meeting in Washington. And you saw the president showing a very respectful posture toward Japan. So the optics were quite good, which I thought was important in terms of establishing momentum for the bilateral relationship. They also issued a joint statement, which had 3 pillars. The first they referred to as cooperation for peace, fundamentally bilateral defense cooperation. The second was growth and prosperity, the economic agenda between the 2 countries. And the third was coordination in the Indo-Pacific, focused mainly on like-minded partners. But that was really about Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which the first Trump administration also endorsed. So long story short, I think there were signs of continuity that proved reassuring for the Ishiba administration and kind of established a foundation. But what's happened since? In just a few weeks, I think Japan, like many other allies of the United States, are learning how to deal with unpredictability during the second Trump administration. So very quickly on the defense pillar, earlier this month, the nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, in a hearing in the Congress, put a lot of pressure on Japan on defense spending, said Japan should actually spend 3% of GDP on defense, kind of a warning sign there. President Trump one day during a media availability complained about the US-Japan Security Treaty, said it was unfair, that Japan doesn't have to defend the United States. The nominee for US Ambassador to Japan, Mr. Glass, in his hearing, talked about economic issues. I won't go into that, but also said that Japan should pay more to host US forces in Japan, another signal of pressure. And then most recently, in advance of a trip pretty soon by Defense Secretary Hegseth to Japan, reports that the Pentagon might scrap a plan to modernize command and control arrangements between the US and Japan. So you have a fundamental agreement about defense cooperation and the health of the alliance, and then you have these signals of pressure, very public signals on Japan. Similar things on the economic front, tariff policy being the obvious one. Some opportunities, LNG, perhaps imports or investment in infrastructure. It's not really clear what will happen with the Nippon Steel deal. I'd be very interested in what my colleagues think of that, but still some uncertainty. So, not really clear where the economic pillar of the alliance is going to end up. And then on the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, I'm not really clear on what that's going to mean under the second Trump administration. Trilateral security cooperation with like-minded countries, probably. We saw a US, Japan, Korea exercise recently off of Jeju Island. We saw a Quad foreign ministers meeting shortly after the inauguration, some potential there. But when I think of the Quad, I think of the 2004 tsunami, which was the origin of the Quad, which was fundamentally about providing public goods in Asia. I'm not sure whether the Trump administration is animated by that. So some potential, but unclear on the degree to which that agenda, as comprehensive as it is, will sustain momentum. Regional economic integration, specifically trade liberalization, another clear pillar of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Don't need to belabor this point, but the US is out of that game in terms of, if you think of economic integration in terms of multilateral trade agreements, US is not going to be involved. In 2023, former Prime Minister Kishida gave a speech updating the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and talked a lot about how important it is for Japan and other countries to support the developing world, the so-called global south. The Trump administration has made very clear it is interested in shuttering the US Agency for International Development. So is official development assistance going to become a pillar of free and open Indo-Pacific? Not very clear. And then fundamentally, FOIP is about the rule of law, freedom, rules-based order. And I'm not really clear on whether the Trump administration is going to embrace these so-called normative dimensions to regional strategy that Japan laid out so eloquently. So what is free and open Indo-Pacific moving forward? I'm not really sure. And then in conclusion, on the way forward, I'm always reminded of the fact that Japan's national security strategy is about upholding a rules-based international order. But I think the Trump administration's foreign policy is a fundamental paradigm shift about disorder, about disruption, about fundamentally changing the way the United States thinks about its leadership role in the world. So how is Japan going to manage this dynamic? Not a unique challenge to Japan, but it's fundamental. If I had to guess, I think Japan will continue to identify not only challenges, but opportunities to work with the Trump administration and maintain a robust US-Japan alliance. But if I had to guess, I think Japan's strategy will also be strengthening even more the partnerships it has with other countries in the region, starting with Australia. And then perhaps Japan's going to have to be more confident and be a bigger leader on the global stage. If you think about global governance, what's going to happen with the G7? How is Japan going to navigate potential friction between the United States and our European partners? So a lot of challenges, but in conclusion, I would say Japan is up to the task. And I think we'll see efforts to strengthen not only the bilateral relationship with the United States, but networking with like-minded partners in Asia and beyond to riff off the event title. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Excellent. Going into the summit meeting, it was really clear that many people worried that Prime Minister Ishiba would be not Prime Minister Abe. There was a real pressure, I think, on Ishiba-san as we went into the meeting. But like you, I was also really impressed at the press conference. It was quite jovial almost. It was a very upbeat mood. So, which puts the leader level connection at least on a reasonably pleasant footing. May not explain all of the policy that then emanates from here on out. You mentioned a couple of things. One is sort of the U.S.-Japan role in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, and the notion that public goods are needed and the US and Japan with others can provide those public goods. I want to come back to you later in the discussion about that because I think that's really, really important. The other is just Japan-US relations are so close and have been so close that the question now becomes, can Japan and others move forward with a diminished role for the United States? Or maybe even without the United States. And you mentioned the G7 in particular, but there's a whole host of other organizations we could think of as well, where this problem solving may be somewhat compromised by the lack of US participation. So I'll come back to you on those points, Nick, but thank you. Our next speaker is Shihoko Goto. Shihoko, welcome, and looking forward to your comments.
Great. Well, thank you. And on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, I want to thank the Nikkei for inviting me to this Asia Undercurrent series. And Sheila, it's so great to be with you and Nick and Hayley today. The topic, Japan-US alliance, advancing security and diplomacy in Asia and beyond, in the context of all the rapid changes in the global order and countries scrambling, quite frankly, to adjust to new realities, it's not an easy one. The pace and the scope of change has been considerable. And as Nick just said, the economic pillar of this in particular is unclear. But what I want to spend a couple of minutes on is to focus not on what's changing, but to focus instead on what has not changed. So the constants that continue to bind Japan and the United States, which may appear to be obvious, but I believe it's worth emphasizing amid the shifting landscape. So when we look to the two of the largest economies in the world and looking at the alliance from an economic perspective, the second Trump administration is pressing ahead with change at home and abroad, changing relations with Japan, with Europe, with Russia, the list goes on. But a strong and stable and prosperous United States is in the interest not just for Washington, the Trump administration, and for Americans, but it is also in the interest of Japan's own economic security and also for global economic interests as well. And I want to point out 3 points as to why a strong US economy is the foundation for the stability of Japanese growth and indeed global expansion moving forward. So the first point is that both countries, both Japan and the United States, have a shared interest in economic prosperity of the other, and that a golden age for one should not preclude the other from flourishing. This is not a zero-sum game. A strong and prosperous Japan is critical for the United States. Japan can be able to best meet the changing needs of its own defense and regional security needs when it thrives. Nick mentioned Bridge Colby talking about Japan should be targeting 3% of its GDP for military expenditure. That can only be achieved so long as Japan is actually thriving. And of course, Japan can be a strong and good partner for the United States when its companies are thriving and willing and able to invest heavily in some of the strategic industries of the United States. And we've seen that with companies like SoftBank. We've seen that with a number of car manufacturers as well. And this is only because the Japanese economy and Japanese companies are doing well. The second point I want to make is that the idea of America first is not about America going alone. Japan and the United States continue to share key economic interests in the Indo-Pacific, especially when it comes to economic security and resilience to coercive action. And those are really of strategic concern to both countries. Reducing dependence on the regimes that could weaponize their economic hegemony for political gain is a goal that both Japan and the United States have shared, and that has been a constant over the last few years as well. They also share an interest in preventing abuse of advanced technology for military industrial purposes. And again, cost effectiveness and efficiency for technology cooperation should also be taken into consideration, and innovation efforts that require the pooling of resources and the pooling of capital should not be underestimated. And then the third point, the final point I want to make, is that the continued strength of the US dollar and the role that the greenback plays as the world's reserve currency is not just in the interest of the United States, but also in the interest of Japan and global financial markets more broadly. And we've seen tremendous geopolitical shifts, and we can have more discussions about what that means for de-dollarization. And we can certainly debate about the optimum value of the US dollar, especially when there are concerns about devaluation on the one hand and how that could boost competitiveness of exports on the other. But whatever the optimum rate of the dollar may or may not be, both the United States and Japan are and should be concerned about growing voices and pushback against the dollar as the world's reserve currency. There is tremendous geopolitical momentum to reduce the use of the greenback in international trade, which in turn would reduce the demand for the US currency as well. Now, we can argue about how that actually can move forward, but certainly those voices are becoming stronger and more. It's also become a binding force for the global South in particular. There is also, we should recognize that there is also shaken confidence in US economic leadership. There's also shaken confidence in the value of US assets. And these all could lead to the destabilization of global financial markets. And that would hurt Japan as one of the largest foreign holders of the US dollar, and of course, US debt as well. And then in conclusion for this opening set of remarks, I do want to point out that Japan has been playing a tremendous role as a global stabilizer. It has come up and really run with this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. But when it comes to the economic front, Japan has played a critical role in actually imagining a world without the United States. Tokyo has been committed to keeping the United States engaged, and we see that even after the United States left the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Tokyo was committed to ensuring that the door was kept open for the United States to return to that fold and to join the CPTPP. But at the same time, Japan has been instrumental in also moving forward with partnerships on the trade front that did not include the United States. So there is this opportunity for Japan to accelerate that it should continue to highlight the shared interests that it has with the United States. And it also has the opportunity and indeed the global expectations to make clear that we are not in a winner-take-all situation, and that Japan has a tremendous role to play in expanding the global economic pie. Thank you.
Sheila, I think you're still on mute, sorry.
Very hard to moderate when you're on mute. Thank you. I was trying to be polite during your speaking. Back to the Shiba meeting with Trump. Very clearly, there are some metrics that the president put out for the Japanese, and I'm glad you mentioned Japanese companies in particular as the source of and contributors to not only the prosperity of Japan, but the prosperity of the United States. So they've laid out this $1 trillion foreign direct investment target. And yet, the president was not terribly excited about allowing the Nippon Steel deal to go through. In fact, he said no, they'd rather have Nippon Steel invest. That produces a quite complicated reaction of Japanese companies, right, about investing in the United States, something I think is a new era in the way in which the commercial interests of Japanese companies and other multinationals around the globe are viewing our politics and the effect on the American market, not in the global market specifically, but the American market. You also focus in on a very important point about the dollar. And we take that for granted here in the United States, right? We just take it for granted that the global financial system is based around the dollar. And I think most of us think, unless you're a specialist like yourself, we all think that creates a firm foundation of confidence in the global financial system. But as you noted, there have been signs, right, pushback globally on this role for the dollar. It's also true that there are countries that don't like the use of the dollar and the use of our economic power via sanctions and coalitions forming around this idea of sanctions to affect or influence the behavior of others. I don't know. I hesitate to wonder what you think about President Trump's idea on cryptocurrency. Not exactly the most stabilizing effect, right, on global finance. But this piece of the puzzle, both corporate investment in the United States economy and this larger question of can the dollar really maintain its confidence, right, in the current environment? Both of those questions really important. I hope you'll come back to those later on in the discussion as well. So Hayley, you're our third person up. Last but certainly not least, welcome. I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel. It's always an honor to be on a panel with the likes of my fellow speakers and as you moderating. And also, can I also thank Nikkei for the invitation. I think this is my third Asia Undercurrent, so I must have done something right those other times to get an invitation back. So I'm really grateful to be here and actually speak an outsider's perspective on the Japan-US alliance. So what I wanted to do is actually frame my comments around alliances generally and the Indo-Pacific, because I know we have a lot of people dialing in from India, Southeast Asia, and all over the world. So what I'll start by saying is that America has multiple allies in the Indo-Pacific: Japan, Australia, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand. It also has several other security partners like India, Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam, the Pacific Islands, and who could forget Australia's neighbour, New Zealand. There is one central question that we are all asking ourselves. Why is President Trump turning his back on allies? Now, obviously, he's not completely turning his back, and Nick mentioned the fantastic Ishiba-Trump conference earlier last month. That meeting was very positive. It was a small victory with recommitments to protecting the Senkakus and also a recommitment to free and open Indo-Pacific and minilaterals like the Quad and the US, Japan, Australia trilateral. All of that very, very positive. But I think as we all recognize, President Trump is upending decades of US policy, whether that's with Europe, trade policy, US development aid, or even in terms of sort of that most sacred US belief in territorial sovereignty when President Trump talks about things like Canada, Greenland, Panama, or even Gaza. If President Trump has a strategy, it's to disrupt, break things and move fast. So what are the implications for the global US alliance system, and what should allies actually do about it? Well, first on implications. Allies are really going to find it difficult to strengthen the old world order of institutions and rules while accommodating a United States that breaks them down. Actually, the biggest challenge I believe that confronts Australia right now is, can Australia pursue two simultaneous, contradictory economic strategies? On the one hand, promoting that whole free and open Indo-Pacific, the free trade, high standard, environmentally sustainable global trading system, while on the other hand, accepting a relationship with the United States that includes tariffs, protectionism, subsidies, and a re-embrace of fossil fuels. You know, in Australia, we've got a saying, can you talk out of both sides of your mouth at once? I also believe this is the primary question facing Japan, the need to uphold a rules-based order, not completely decoupled from China, but at the same time remaining aligned and coordinated with the United States. And whether or not we can pursue these two contradictory foreign policies effectively at the same time is just a question I have no idea if that's possible, because we've never done those two things at once before. We've never needed to do those two things at once before. So I really want to hear what my panel thinks about that. The second point I'll make is that while we should avoid catastrophizing the US retreat from global rules and norms, US allies really should ready themselves to respond to even tougher choices in future. And it's here I'm going to talk about a few pretty unhappy futures, but I think it's important to discuss and plan for these so that we can also avoid them. So for a long time, Australia was accused of pursuing a contradictory foreign policy, boasting having the United States as our key security ally, while having China as our largest trading partner. Now, despite Australia's experience with Chinese economic coercion from 2020 to 2024, China is still our largest trading partner. 1/3 of Australia's two-way trade is with China. 1/4 of our exports are with China, even despite knowing that China could easily cut off trade with Australia again. So Australia's really been juggling our foreign relations for a long time. But for us and for others, it's poised to get harder. I said that Australia's current challenge is trying to pursue those two simultaneous foreign policies at once. A looming challenge that we're only starting to discuss very quietly in private circles in Canberra is, could the Trump administration force allies to choose between the US and China in technology and trade battlefields? This would really be a nightmare situation for Japan and Australia, and would place both of our governments at a crossroads with our alliance relationship with the United States. Two examples, for instance, so under Biden, tough rules were brought in that would essentially ban Chinese electric vehicles from American roads by the end of this decade. The US essentially sees Chinese-made EVs like BYD as sort of like a computer with steel wrapped around it. Chinese parent companies could extract the data from EVs, and even some Japanese companies I've spoken with have told me they're concerned that the car batteries themselves could be shut down remotely. So that's one example. The other example is the US seeking to ban TikTok unless its parent company ByteDance divests its shares. Now, the deadline for that has been extended until the 5th of April, which is next week. But the big question that both of these things, electric vehicles and sort of social media, the questions that we're asking ourselves in Australia is, will the US ask Australia to follow its lead and ban, Chinese goods, Chinese technology, Chinese EVs? There are lots of Chinese EVs on Australian cars, including ones that are driven by senior public servants. So it's a really difficult question for us. I have one final point, and then I think it's important we get into the conversation. What should we do about this? The shift in US approach to allies might not be permanent, but we can't wait 4 years to find out. In an era of high living costs and backlash to globalization, the US is redefining its global role in economics, security, and alliances. And this is putting the future of the US alliance system in Asia and globally under question. The US is unlikely to reverse course at the end of 4 years, even with the next president, because this system is in place now that is going to foster another American president that will have very similar policies, just like Biden carried on many of President Trump's first-term policies. US alliances certainly aren't dead, but they are being reshaped with a reduced role for the United States in a more multipolar world. 3 actions Japan and Australia should prioritize in our bilateral interactions are shoring up key lines of supply. I'm talking about things like for energy, both traditional fossil fuels and clean energy, and core inputs to capability like critical minerals and semiconductors. The second thing that I think we should actually do together might come as a surprise because it might be down in the weeds, but it's actually sharing best practice on how to address our low labor productivity in both countries. I know productivity can be a boring topic, but the truth is that we both have declining, aging populations, and we have a need for potentially more immigration, and that would really change our 2 societies. And my last point about how Japan and Australia should cooperate together is coordinating more closely, but also working unilaterally with other countries. India, South Korea, the UK, Canada, Vietnam, and the EU, because we really need to work together to find out what this new era looks like, both with and without the United States. So thank you so much. I'll leave my comments there.
Excellent, Hayley. Thank you so much. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunity for the Japan-Australia partnership, even if the Japan-US partnership becomes a little bit less productive. Let's put it that way. We've got a lot on the table. I think one of the things, Hayley, in your remarks that was really striking to me is just, and I share your view where you ended, which is that we are not going to bounce back and forth between the Biden sort of vision of our alliances versus the Trump vision. I think there is change under the surface of both administrations. You can feel change in the United States about new generations of Americans wondering about what the global role is and what problems we should attempt to solve with other countries. And again, that agenda looks very different if you talk to 20-year-olds in the United States and across the globe than it looks for our generation or your generation. I do think it's also true that the case needs to be made to the American public today on why we have an alliance and what that alliance does for us. And again, it's a crude language, and people listen to President Trump and think, oh, that's just not the way we are. That's not American to talk that way. It's very transactional. But I think there's a broader kind of questioning going on in the United States about, is this role that the United States has played in the post-war order, is it really helping America? It may be helping others, but is it really helping us? And so on both dimensions, and all 3 of the panelists raised these questions, whether it's the military security alliances or their treaty allies, whether it's the global engagement in development and development assistance, and whether it's the larger competitiveness of our economies and how the global economy offers opportunity for that prosperity. All of these dimensions, I think, are fundamentally being questioned, and the case needs to be made We are used to just assuming that this is an American interest and the case needs to be made at home. I just wanted to shift gears to the discussion. I have a couple questions for all three of you. You can pick and choose, as I said before we started, which ones you might want to answer, and so don't feel forced, but also feel that you can take your answer in a direction that maybe I phrased it in the detailed direction that's different than the way I phrase it. But I just wanted to, we have watched, and all of us have been watching the US-Japan partnership over the last decade in a little bit of amazement, right? It has really transformed in not only the things that we think about doing together, but the things that we can actually do together. So it's not just bilateral US-Japan, but it is the strategic networking with Australia, with others in the region, even with the NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is a much, much different agenda for the bilateral alliance than I think we've seen in quite some time. Now that we're so interconnected, I would say, in our strategic aims, this is also, I think, part of the explanation of why the Trump language and the Trump approach to alliances comes as such a shock, because our expectations of strategic convergence are actually quite high. But I wanted to ask you if you agree with me on that. Maybe you don't, but also to ask you whether you think the US and Japan today, leaving aside the rhetoric of the new administration, are we better able to develop and implement strategic goals together, the United States and Japan, with partners like Australia, Hayley? Are we still trying to build that kind of capacity? So I just wanted to make sure that our audience has a good sense of where all three of you sit in terms of how much progress has been made on this. Nick, can I go back to you to start us off?
Sure, thank you. I'll pick up on your first comment really related to expectations of strategic convergence. I think that's really the source of the shock around the world in response to the foreign policy prerogatives that the second Trump administration has articulated. One of the things that has struck me is that allies like Japan are used to coordinating regional strategy with the United States related to potential adversaries. Under the second Trump administration, that process might be reversed. It looks like President Trump prefers to talk to adversaries first and then think about the implications for allies. So you see this in the sudden outreach to Russia and an instinct to try to bring an end to the Ukraine war. Although I agree very much with what Hayley said about economic security and the instinct, I think, in both political parties in the US to accentuate economic competition with China. President Trump also seems interested and is signaling a desire to pursue bilateral summitry with Xi Jinping. And this might be further afield, but let me just speculate that I think that same instinct might apply to North Korea, again, in the context of the president wanting to bring an end to conflict, make peace, and then allow the United States to focus more on strengthening the foundations of the domestic economy. So that's a fundamental shift. And that is very shocking. With regard to whether we can coordinate strategic priorities among US and our regional allies, I think that's still true. Because on the other hand, as shocking as some of the pronouncements from the second Trump administration have been, Japan, Australia, and other allies have experienced this once before. There was a first Trump administration. And I think our allies have figured out how to engage, develop a positive agenda in ways that animate the Trump administration and connect with its views of what core US national interests are. And I think that's the fundamental question, is figuring out what that is, defining it, and then coming up with ideas about how Japan and other allies can support that. But I also think that I suspect there's a new dynamic, building on what Hayley said about Japan-Australia relations, that Japan and its partners in the region, I think instinctively will look for ways to strengthen their own partnerships, and then together pursue consistent messages with the Trump administration. We used to emphasize that in the context of engaging China. And now I think Japan and regional allies are going to have to come up with a consistent messaging strategy for Washington. But again, I'm quite confident that they'll succeed.
So Hayley has a two-finger there. So Hayley, jump on in.
Yeah, just really quickly on Nick's point about what are core US values. This is, I think, the actual critical point is we can't have a combined strategy if we don't know what the US really values for the next 4 years. And I think when we had President Biden, we could see what some of the core values were. They came through a lot more strongly in terms of environmental protection. But even on environmental protection, what was so interesting was that in terms of the US competition with China and national security, you could see that the US was choosing to prioritize competition with China when it decided to bring in, eventual bans on Chinese EVs and other clean energy technologies coming from China. So the values there, you could see them by reading through the tea leaves. I think with the second Trump presidency, it is extremely hard to see what the administration values, and that's going to make it harder for allies.
I want to shift the lens from Washington to Tokyo for a second. Shihoko, I'm coming to you with this one. I do feel like we just have to caution ourselves that we're only 2 months in. It feels like a little bit longer, but we're only 2 months in. So in terms of both developing the team that's going to lead, right, the foreign policy, strategic development of the Trump administration, as well as just having events and relationships and meetings unfold over the course of this next year. If we come back a year from now, we'll have a lot more, I think, grasp of just exactly what's rhetoric and what's policy, I think. But Shihoko, we're talking about political change here in Washington a lot. But again, on this question of whether or not the Japan and United States are well positioned for strategic coordination going forward, how do you feel? You can obviously talk about Washington as much as you'd like, but bring us also a little bit of insight into Prime Minister Ishiba. This is a very big shift, right, in leadership in Japan as well. The political foundations of Ishiba's position are a little bit different than Kishida before him or Abe before that, or Suga and Abe. Do we have a sense of where Japan sits at the moment in terms of expectations of the alliance?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question insofar as from Washington's perspective on expectations for Japan, that has remained unchanged. That regardless of whether it's the Trump administration version 1 or version 2, or whether it's the Biden administration, there is more expectation for Japan to do more. And what that more means depends. The question is there political will within Japan to do so? And is there political will and political capital to do so? And the challenge right now is that because of, yes, the Ishiba administration has been recently within the last year elected, but its political foundation is seen as perhaps not strong enough. It is grappling with a great deal of change amid a great deal of economic uncertainty. And perhaps I would say Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, former US Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, said, put it best, that one of the biggest constraints for Japan is confidence of the Japanese themselves, and that is lacking. And so we here look at what Japan has achieved from Abe onwards. It's not simply an Abe issue. Yes, he came up with the idea of FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, that has been embraced not just by the United States, but the Indo-Pacific concept has been embraced across Europe. It's also been embraced by South Korea as well. And it has been this idea, Japan has been accused of not having a grand strategy, but it is pretty much a pretty strong regional strategy that has legs. At the same time, Japan has played this pivotal role in bringing together countries, right? So we look at something like IPEF, the Indo-Pacific economic framework that the Biden administration had put forward. But it was Japan that was able to bring forward some of the key Southeast Asian countries to the fold to make it much more credible. Now we can argue about whether IPEF actually is going to have a future or not, but the point being that Japan has been at the forefront of being a bridge builder. And I believe that the Japanese pride in what it has been able to achieve on that front, the record that it has had in development assistance, for instance, in Southeast Asia, the demand that is being placed on Japan right now to continue on that trajectory, and the need in the region for Japan to take on that role is continuing to increase. The challenge, though, is, of course, amid the domestic, I don't want to say turmoil, because compared to Washington, the political shifts in Tokyo are quite tepid, but nonetheless, they are quite rocky, and it is difficult to come up with a strategic framework in that has the political backing to push forward at the moment.
No, it's true. I mean, I think people, a lot of my Japanese friends will say, oh, it's very, very rocky in Tokyo. And it's, well, it's also a little bit rocky over here. And so by comparison, I look at Japanese politics and see it as sort of mild-mannered rocky. But Ishiba is ruling from a minority coalition in the parliament, which of course is a very weak legislative position from which to think about government policy, especially on the difficult issues, the kinds of economic security issues that many of you have mentioned, but also on how are they going to pay for the defense commitments that they've made and that Kishida-san made at the end of 2022. So I think, you know, there's challenges ahead for Prime Minister Ishiba. There's an upper house election this summer, which, you know, we'll see how that goes. But it is a little bit of a muddling through moment for Tokyo, and instead of the grand strategic moment that we saw with both Prime Minister Abe and then I think more recently with Prime Minister Kishida on the global stage. I'm going to turn to some specific relationships, and feel free to say no thank you to these questions. So let's start with China. We can't talk about the US-Japan alliance. A number of you have already sort of alluded to China, mentioned China. You know, China will shape the future of both the United States and Japan, in fact, and Australia too, I might mention. Hayley described that quite well. Where do we see the US-Japan alliance in terms of their focus on China? Do we see them still, you know, aligned quite closely? I think there has always been a slight divergence in interests in the way in which Tokyo engages with Beijing and Beijing engages with Tokyo, and vice versa with Washington and Beijing. I sense that we're at a moment now. I think you alluded to the possibility of a Trump meeting with Xi, but there's also hovering in the Japanese conversation a little bit of engagement on the Japan-China front as well. So let's just think a little bit about China, and is there scope, do you think, for both countries to have renewed engagement? Do you see dissonance possible? Do you feel that our strategic convergence is durable if we start to have different economic engagements or ties with China? Hayley, do you want to kick us off on that one? We'll reverse the order.
Sure, I'd be very happy to. I mean, I'd be embarrassed to speak about it from a Japanese or American perspective. So why don't I speak regionally?
Yes. Yeah.
Obviously, ever since China joined the World Trade Organization back in 2001, China has had a remarkable development. That's only, 24 years ago. It's incredible how different things are today from what they were like back then. The way I see a second Trump presidency in relation to China and China's relations with the region is that it's presenting a totally different offering to what the United States, Japan, or Australia could offer in the past. And what I mean by that is, now that we have a second Trump presidency who says he's a deal maker, he's a businessman, countries in Southeast Asia, for example, might be thinking, okay, well, if this is all about deal making, the deal that China is offering me is far more attractive now, considering the development aid and other investments that China could make in our infrastructure versus the US retreat from aid. And I think it's lower emphasis on Southeast Asia. I don't know that the Trump administration has thought about Southeast Asia more than in terms of shifting supply chains from China to places like Vietnam and the Philippines. So in terms of a simply deal-oriented relationship, China is offering something that's much more powerful. I think that's also the case in the Pacific Islands, which is a new battleground for US-China strategic competition. I was there at the end of last year, and there is a competition there in terms of providing Pacific Islands telecommunications, data centers. And again, these countries are savvy. They're developing countries, but they know the risks. But the problem is that China is able to do things in the region that the US, Japan, and Australia simply can't replicate. China can move quickly, it can provide finance immediately, and so those countries weigh up that risk and the risk of Chinese access to their, ICT backbones, and actually think that the risk is worth it. So countries like the US, Japan, and Australia, we need to determine where our priorities lie, and there's a lot of burden in coordination in terms of coordinating our three approaches, which is actually why I think it might be better that we do things bilaterally with countries and just coordinate rather than trilateral cooperation. Very interested to hear what Nick and Shihoko think about that too.
Great, thank you. Nick, I wonder if I could just ask you about China in our more hard security domain. We are poised, where we were poised. I'm not sure now if we are actually poised, but to really start to integrate operationally with the self-defense forces in Japan. So US forces that are stationed in the Indo-Pacific, specifically the US Forces Japan Command was beginning to think about amping up to upgrade its capabilities. Taiwan, of course, looms large in this calculus, but not exclusively. Do you see us continuing that path of a much more integrated command and control military response to China? Even with Bridge Colby's 3%, I'm sure he would like to see this happen. But what do you think is going to happen given the larger diplomatic framing of the relationship with Tokyo and Beijing?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Japan has been very effective in explaining to the United States what it's like to be a frontline state. And to face the China challenge day in and day out, and what deterrence means for a country in Asia. And I think the United States appreciates that. And I appreciate your emphasis on so-called alliance integration or interoperability, because that sends very powerful deterrent signals across the region. In my opening remarks, I referenced these rumors that perhaps the Department of Defense will not pursue the establishment of a counterpart, U.S. counterpart to Japan's new Joint Operational Command in Japan. Not necessarily a guarantee, but if that were to take place, that would be a missed opportunity to demonstrate to China that you cannot break up the U.S.-Japan alliance. If anything, it's becoming closer, and that's because of the coercive pressure that China is applying across the region. So that would be a missed opportunity operationally, and I think a disaster with respect to strategic signaling. So this is an instance where Japan can appreciate perhaps a new US administration's emphasis on efficiency and cost cutting, but also explain that arbitrary cost cutting has operational and strategic consequences. I do think that the fundamental instinct, if you read what we've seen from Trump administration officials so far, it's forward presence in Asia, which is reassuring, strengthening presence in the Southwest Island chain. But there's a difference between declaring that and realizing it in practice. So I can sympathize with friends in Japan who are a little anxious about this, because this is an example of an ally stepping up and trying to demonstrate an instinct to do more, and then the United States not reciprocating, and that could have ramifications down the road.
Thank you, Nick. Shihoko, China. How would you think about our partnership with Japan and then the looming China challenge today?
So the United States obviously is not operating in a vacuum, and we've seen greater overtures from China reaching out to Japan and other countries as well. The most recently, we've had that foreign ministers meeting between Japan, South Korea, and China, and Japan paving the way for a summit meeting between these. So when we talk about trilateral, we have to actually make sure which trilateral we're talking about, and certainly the Japan, Korea, China trilateral is something that is moving forward. From China's perspective, they do, especially at this latest meeting amongst the foreign ministers, they wanted to champion some of the areas that the United States has usually been at the forefront of, talking about the liberal international order and rules-based engagement and the like. But at the same time, it's interesting how when China came out with the statement concluding the meeting, the Japanese made an official pushback saying that that isn't what we meant. So certainly there is distrust, and the Japanese are not shying away from showing their concern about engaging. It's a relationship that is that the Japanese need to tread very carefully on. Another issue about the China challenge, of course, the United States and Japan have a very different view, if not at the very least, because geography is destiny, right? Japan has no choice but to engage with China. And of course, China is a tremendous trading partner for Japan as well. And as we talk about de-risking from China, it is a China +1 strategy and never about completely decoupling from China. That said, where are some common issues, especially when it comes to economic concerns? There is shared concern about China exporting its excess capacity. There is great concern, of course, about the economic coercion. There is great concern about the advancements that China has made in AI and advanced technology, and that it could actually be the rule maker and continue to define some of the progress that is being made, which takes the United States really completely by surprise. So there are those shared concerns, but I see a future where it's not simply, it's going to have to be issues-based, that the more specific the concerns are between Japan and the United States vis-a-vis China, the more progress they would be able to actually make.
Great, wonderful. We could have a whole hour just talking about this particular aspect of not only the alliance, but also regional cooperation. But I'm starting to get a lot of questions. So I'm going to add my questions and their questions together. And so we'll move seamlessly into the discussion with the audience. For those of you who haven't had a chance, please do post your questions at the bottom of your Nikkei channel or the YouTube channel. There's still time, and the staff that are supporting us so well will make sure that your questions get addressed by the panelists. But let's talk a little bit. It's not unrelated to the China question. Obviously, we're all observing the new relationship between China and Russia, the so-called No Limits Partnership, and also the extension of that relationship now to the Moscow Pyongyang security treaty, the new security treaty and technological transfer arrangements that we think are all underway. This is a kind of, Japan, and a number of you mentioned the G7 and the way in which we're looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Japan and the other Indo-Pacific allies of the United States have been quite forward-leaning in terms of supporting NATO, supporting European security, supporting Ukraine. This is a moment, of course, when we're all watching with some deep breathing, I believe, the way in which President Trump's approaching this idea of negotiating a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. So there's two parts to this question. One is, what do you think has happened to former Prime Minister Kishida's statement that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow? Has this started to shift now that we're in this different phase now of American engagement with both Russia and Ukraine? Or do you see opportunity for not only Japan, but other Indo-Pacific allies to engage with Europe in different ways than the United States might? And also, just very specifically, the Japanese response to Ukraine. Japan is not in the midst of the European discussions at the moment about how to help Ukraine, but certainly the idea of Japan continuing to serve in that critical role of support for Ukraine certainly holds true for President Zelensky, I think, and others in Europe. So on that note, it's a question about has the war in Ukraine changed some of the fundamental ways we think about Indo-Pacific relations? And now, as we approach a ceasefire and a negotiation, perhaps, of a ceasefire, how does that factor in if is there a real difference between Tokyo, Washington, Canberra? We'll add Australia here, Hayley, as well, if you wanted to tackle that piece. Anybody want to talk about the Russian piece of the pie or the European piece of the pie?
I'll jump in briefly, but I'm very interested in what my colleagues have to say. It's interesting that for many years, Japan had a Russia strategy to pull Russia away from China.
Yeah.
And the war in Ukraine forced Japan to change its strategy on a dime. And I will always commend Prime Minister Kishida for leaning forward and leading the international community. Fast forward to today, what concerns me is a negotiation that's not only addressing Russia's interests in Europe, but potentially Russia's interests in Asia. That's going to put tremendous pressure on Japan. And what would Japan do in response if the United States is more focused on accommodating Russian interests than those of an Asian ally like Japan? I think this is already happening, but I think what Japan is going to do even more is ensure that European partners remain focused on the Indo-Pacific. I think the most interesting dynamic in recent years is the extent to which the conversation between the United States, Japan, and the Europeans really became aligned on regional dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. And I think if the United States is going to shift its perspective, Japan is going to lean forward and ensure that they're not only talking about the future of European security, but coordinating together on Indo-Pacific dynamics.
Great, thanks, Nick. Shihoko?
Yeah, just very briefly. So no government is looking at how Ukraine comes out of this, how it fares, than the Taiwanese government. And that's what you are seeing from Taipei is a more muscular note that is trying to really kind of make its case about not simply relying on the United States, but enhancing its own defense capabilities and also being able to be psychologically prepared as well. That said, given the reality of the situation, there is a lot of concern about what is happening in Ukraine does not necessarily bode well for Taiwan. To what extent can to what extent can Japan actually come to the assistance of Taiwan is really the question that you're asking, I think. Japan's commitment to Taiwan may be unwavering, but it's more of the mechanisms to actually do that in a defense space. I believe the time has come for Japan to step up more on some of the other areas that Taiwan is actually being attacked in right now. And Taiwan may not be engaged in a kinetic warfare, but the cyber attacks that it faces, the disinformation campaigns that it faces, the blockades and the prospect of blockades, the energy insecurities that it faces, these are areas that Japan can actually do more on, and the United States can do more on. And I believe that there is the momentum for Japan to do more is here. And then one final thing about the European theater and NATO looking more to Asia and the like. We've seen the IP4, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea becoming official observer countries in NATO, but that is really very much focused on the Ukrainian theater. I think having greater engagement of NATO, having that representative office in the Indo-Pacific, that will be not necessarily a deterrence mechanism in itself, but it will definitely send a positive signal that NATO is looking beyond its own borders, that there is an opportunity for greater coordination and cooperation, and certainly information sharing between Europe and the Indo-Pacific theaters.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was not actually making the Taiwan connection, but I mean, in theory, the Taiwan problem loomed large when Prime Minister Kishida made that statement. I think what was so the follow-on to Abe's FOIP was Kishida's really embrace of the G7 and standing strong with the G7 in response to Russian aggression, but also leaning forward in defense technology agreements with European partners, right? UK and Italy and the support fighter comes to mind, and then the French deal that came afterwards. There's a lot of development there that could be very, very beneficial, both for European and for Japanese security. But I also feel that it was a masterstroke away of Japanese diplomacy. It was quiet. It was building up relationships, and yet at the end of it, all of the major European powers within the last six years or so have declared their Indo-Pacific strategy. So it wasn't just about aggression against Ukraine. It was also about really pulling the Europeans into this conversation, right, about a rules-based order and how it was going to develop in the Indo-Pacific. So Japan, once again, was very catalytic in the way that it brought people to the table, and the reciprocity of that, Europe to Indo-Pacific security, and then Japan and the Indo-Pacific 4, obviously, to European security when it mattered, was really, really, really a strong statement. Hayley, did you want to add anything here about the Australian perspective or the NATO engagement?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'd be very happy to. So I just reflected on it, and I think that, the best thing that could have happened in terms of Russia invading Ukraine was to link our two theaters, to actually give people in the Indo-Pacific a tangible sense that this could really happen to us. And if it did happen to us, it wouldn't be between Russia and the US. It would be between China and the US, and that would be a global conflict. So I think just sort of to reflect more broadly about Ukraine and its role, I actually think back to, obviously, Ukraine is not part of NATO, but the United States did convince Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons all that time ago in exchange for a sort of vague security guarantee. And even Australia has a vague security guarantee. Our treaty alliance with the United States only commits us to consult each other in times of conflict. And the only time AUKUS was ever invoked was when our Prime Minister was in Washington, D.C. on September 11. And so, we like to grasp onto that treaty and say, oh, we'll come to your protection, United States, please don't forget us. Australia is still doing that. Our Prime Minister said that if asked, we would consider sending troops to Ukraine, because Australia doesn't like to be left out. But I think countries are also reflecting on President Zelensky and President Trump's Oval Office meeting, in terms of President Trump saying that it'd be very difficult to do a business deal with Ukraine the way it was acting. And so, thinking about deal making, I think all countries in the Indo-Pacific are thinking, what can they offer the United States? And that's why you see, for instance, in Taiwan's case, TSMC offering $100 billion investment in the United States. You see Australia in January giving a $500 million payment, down payment for the US's defense submarine industrial base. So I think all countries are thinking, what can they offer the United States? And even though that's not what we're used to, it is Donald Trump putting America first.
Mm-hmm. So we have exactly 4 minutes left before we have to start to wrap this up. And I don't want to, I could sit here and talk to you guys forever, but let's try and be timely and allow people to get on with their day in Japan, and for those of us on the East Coast, maybe to think about bed. But there's a couple of economic questions here that I'm going to put together. They weren't originally put together, but I do want to make sure that we give the economic side of the relationship as much attention as we can in 4 minutes. But there's a really fundamental question here, and you don't have to do the big picture, but I just wanted you guys to think about it and what you would say to this question. We've talked about trade. And the globalization, the liberalization of trade has been this momentum for decades and decades, right, over the post-war period. Is it over? And if it's over, are we going back to sort of a bilateral trade deal kind of negotiated way of thinking about our economic relations with others? So that's one. Again, not everybody has to answer it. The second economic question that we haven't addressed here is this question about the monetary and economic energy or dynamism in the region. Where do you see groupings coming together, potentially like the BRICS? Do you see groupings now taking a little bit more agency, for lack of a better word, more of a assertive role now that you've got a little bit of shivering going on in the advanced industrialized economies? So that's a question. Are there other groupings we should be paying attention to in the region for a more dynamic leadership role? So those two economic questions, anybody want to take either or the other? Big picture, are we ending globalization? Yes, Hayley.
I'll have a two-finger because I've spoken a lot. All I wanted to say, because of your question about groupings, who should we be focusing on? And Nick in his opening comments talked about the Quad meeting and how that was really positive, and President Trump reaffirmed, the US government reaffirmed its commitments to groupings. One thing I really wanted to bring to the attention of all the viewers is, and this might have sort of gone unnoticed, but the Quad joint statement that was released could actually be quite significant. For the very first time in its history, the statement said that the 4 countries would commit to territorial integrity are upheld and defended. So I think that's quite a change in language from the Quad. You wouldn't hear a Quad talking about defending any territory in the past. So I think that's an extremely positive sign. And obviously the Quad's also got supply chains, technology, critical minerals, and lots of other economic aspects to it. So that is one group to watch.
Thank you. If nobody's gonna, then we got 1 minute left, and there's a really good question that a lot of people have brought up. So I'd like to, I know, Nick, you want to jump in on the Quad. I apologize, but this is an interesting question very quickly. Trump is a highly transactional leader. That's the way we all think about him. He's being described. What do you all think this means for deterrence, the extension of the US nuclear umbrella? Does this transactional America undermine confidence in the American nuclear deterrent? Nick, can I ask you to go first on that one, or would you like to pass?
No, sure. What would be evidence of lack of confidence in US extended deterrent commitment? The Japanese context, I can think of 2 things: a sudden, robust debate about constitutional revision, and the need for Japan to be more explicit about the purpose of its military. And the second would be an obvious one, which is a more robust debate about nuclear weapons. Taboo, of course, but if the credibility of US extended deterrence is in question, how do you deter China, Russia, and North Korea? That would be a fundamental question. I don't think we're there yet, but certainly worth pondering.
Yeah. Shihoko, you have the last word. You can go on trade or on deterrence. The floor is yours.
I'm tempted to talk about the nuclear issue, but I'm going to stay in my comfort zone. Let me go back to the whole BRICS and globalization issue. BRICS has expanded. It's now got at least 10 member countries. They're quite disparate. Countries like Brazil and Ethiopia don't have a lot in common, but nevertheless, they're part of that grouping. One of the biggest binding forces of that is this frustration about a US-led economic order. And they would argue that it's not just that, it's about creating investment opportunities and the like. But we have to be honest here, this idea of the US economic leadership is under severe challenge from the global South. That said, I remain cautiously optimistic about globalization. We have seen changes in how we talk about supply chains. We're no longer talking about supply chain efficiency. We're talking about supply chain resiliency. We're not talking about no globalization, but it's a new form of interdependency, and interdependency will continue. But I do think, on a positive note, where I can see Japanese leadership is this. As we see greater consolidation of industries into the power hands of a few, this Japanese commitment, the social compact that Japan has, and a lot of European countries have, about social good, common good, investing in common good, that resonates tremendously across borders and across economic development as well. So my hope is that Japan will continue quietly to articulate that value system and take on, adopt policies that could actually push that momentum.
Thank you. Thank you all. You've been remarkably resilient, quick thinking, quick on your feet, and thoughtful to boot. So thank you all for wonderful conversation. I just wanted to say that what you can feel in this conversation, I think it's pretty prevalent, not just in the US-Japan partnership, but also obviously with Hayley in Australia and across the region and indeed across the world, is what we were sensing was a greater integration of strategic collaboration and cooperation among the United States and its allies, its various allies, European as well as Indo-Pacific. There is a deep fear of the dissembling of that hard-won integration. And I think that's a fear that we share here in the United States as much as many of those who are in allied countries around the world. I think the US-Japan, the relationship, the strategic value to both countries is immense. But so too is the catalytic effect of this alliance on so much that happens in the Indo-Pacific, so much that happens indeed globally, that's something that we have to be careful that we don't lose. That sense of value, in addition to the large agenda of issues that we cooperate on. And then finally, you know, the world is changing fast. A number of the speakers use this accelerated pace and broader scope to talk about what we're confronting today. We are breathless in Washington in the last couple of months because of the changes here. But remember, we're also breathless about what's happened over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years in global affairs. We have 2 wars. We have significant potential for serious conflict in the Indo-Pacific. There are, as I think Hayley used the word, there's hard choices ahead, both for Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington. And these hard choices will have systemic, regional and systemic impact. So this is a relationship where we have to explore our differences as well as our commonalities. We also have to continue to build pathways to ensure that the US-Japan alliance remains strong, even if it can't always be perfectly steady. So join me, everybody, in thanking our 3 speakers who are terrific and tremendous, and also to the 2,000 of you on the webinar who came to listen to us. We're truly grateful that you had time to share with us. This is our season finale, as we introduced, but also we have a post-webinar satisfaction survey that I'm asked to share with you. If you're on the Nikkei channel or the YouTube Live, our organizers would love to hear from you about what you thought, and they would really appreciate your input. I want to say thank you to Nikkei Shimbun and to the government of Japan for pulling us all into this fascinating conversation, and for the larger Asia Undercurrent series itself. So to all of you on the East Coast of the United States, good night. And to those of you in the Pacific, where the day is just beginning, we wish you a happy and safe and hopefully full of cherry blossom day ahead of you. Thank you all. Good night.